Hey, Steve here, and in this Photoshop Curves Adjustment Layer tutorial, I'm going to give you 3 simple ways that you can use to make stunning adjustments to your photos. Now, if you want to take anything that you see in this tutorial to the next level by getting started with luminosity masking, then what you can do is just click the link in the description below this video, and you can download my free PDF guide, An Introduction to Luminosity Masking, and there's a video tutorial there to go with that as well. And that will get you up and running with your first luminosity mask. But for now, let's get on with the Curves Adjustment Layer tutorial. So first, remember, if you like this video, then please give it a like, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, just to let me know that you enjoy this video and this kind of video and you want me to keep making more. Okay, so one of the first things that you're going to want to do when you open a photo in Photoshop is get the color balance right, because no matter how well we've set the correct white balance in camera, if you're shooting at sunrise or sunset, or if there's any kind of color cast or tint to the natural light, then the camera's not going to know what that should end up looking like. So one of the best things that we can do right at the start of the workflow is get the color correct. And the curves adjustment just happens to be a really great tool for doing that. So I'll just run you through a couple of examples of the kind of adjustment you can make. So I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer here. And if you're photographing something where there's like a neutral color, so this white water through the middle is actually a really good candidate for that, then you can use these eyedroppers here, just in the side, just to the side of the curve in the middle of the properties panel. And you can either use the white point or the gray point. I find the gray point is probably the best, because the white point, it's going to give you a pure white, but it's also going to blow the brightness out. So what we can do is click on this middle eyedropper here to set the grey point in the image. And then what we want to do is click on a colour that should be a neutral colour. So for example, this white water running through the middle of the shot here, I'll just click around the middle here. And that has that has made quite a drastic adjustment, so it's warmed the image up quite significantly. A quick tip, you can actually just keep clicking around the image just to fine tune that if that first adjustment doesn't quite look right. So I think for me that first adjustment was a bit too warm, so I just clicked around a couple of times until I got a bit more of a subtle version of that. So here's before and here's after. So you know, that water through the middle is a lot more of a neutral color, and as a result it looks a lot more inviting as a nice colorful warm sunrise. So if you notice here in the curves property panel, we've got some red, green and blue channels that have sort of moved up and down, and we can just about see those lines here in the properties panel. If you want, another great way to make your color adjustments is to click this drop down here with RGB, which is the default, and then you can actually click into the red channel, and then you can just manually adjust this curve up and down and make your adjustments by eye. So what you would want to do here is, you know, if you know that the image looks a bit too cool, then you can come into the red channel and push the reds up a bit to increase the red, into the green. I often find that sunrises come out a bit green, so you know, I'll now and again reduce the green curve, pull that down a bit. In this case, the auto adjustment has actually done a pretty good job, so I won't fiddle with that too much. And then blue, we've reduced the amount of blue just by dragging the curve down there. So there we go. That is the first thing that you can do with the curves adjustment to really make your images stand out from the crowd. There is just right at the start of the workflow, get that color balance correct. So moving on to tip number two, and that is to use the curves adjustments to increase contrast. So I'll just add another adjustment layer here, and it's quite simple really. You can add contrast to your image by creating a simple S shape in this curve that runs through the middle of the properties panel. So to do that, you can just click once towards the sort of upper third of the curve and then push that point up, And then around about the bottom third, you can click and then drag that point down, and that is increasing contrast. So as I did that, I'm not sure if you noticed the image was changing, but here's a before and after look at that adjustment when I turn it off and on. We can see the contrast has increased. And in my workflow, I tend to build up these kind of adjustments gradually. So I'll have many, many adjustments all building up. Each one is quite subtle and is often only applied to a certain area in the image. But then, each one looks a bit subtle and takes a little bit of time. But when you add them all together, they really add up to a nice, refined, finished image. So on the subject of selectively adding contrast to your image, you can do that using this curves adjustment by brushing into the layer mask to either brush this effect in or out where you want it or where you don't want it to be. Now when you add a curves adjustment layer, or any adjustment layer for that matter, it's going to come with its own layer mask already attached, and it's going to start out white, which means that the layer mask is essentially doing nothing, so the adjustment that you make is fully visible. And what we can do, just for example, if we take a black brush, and I'll just put that onto 100% opacity on the brush, we can just click into the layer mask and then brush into the image here. And when we paint black with a black brush into a white layer mask, we are essentially masking this adjustment out in those areas where we're brushing. And so as I do this here, we can see this foreground where I'm just running the brush through at the moment. As I do that, you'll notice the contrast is returning back to its original state in those areas where I'm brushing. And the layer mask kind of looks like, it's kind of showing us where I'm brushing with that black brush as well. So if I toggle this layer off and on again now, we can see this contrast adjustment is only being applied in the top half and the middle third and top third of the image. So that's how you can mask an adjustment out. So what you can do, if I just add another curves adjustment, then let's add a bit more contrast, so that looks pretty good throughout the rest of the image, but down here the shadows are a bit too dark. So what we can do is just take that brush, that black brush, and just remove that effect by brushing into the layer mask just in those parts where it's gone a bit too dark. So moving on now to technique or tip number 3 for your curves adjustments, and that is to use the curves adjustment layer to affect and to adjust the brightness of different parts of your image. So kind of using the same idea as what I just showed you there with brushing into the layer mask to remove and add contrast, let's add another curves adjustment layer, and now let's just brighten the image. Okay, so that looks good, but I don't want it that bright everywhere. Let's say I just want that brightness to be applied in the water. So in a situation like this where I want the adjustment to be only applied in a smaller part of the image, what we can do is actually invert this layer mask. On the keyboard we can hold Command on a Mac or Control on a PC and press the I key. So Command or Control and I, and that will invert the layer mask and turn it black, therefore hiding this adjustment entirely. So now to reveal that adjustment, so in other words to brush this brightness from this curves adjustment into a specific part of the image, we can just take that white brush now and brush into the layer mask, kind of in reverse to what we did before, painting black to conceal. We can paint with white to reveal. So I'll just reduce the opacity. You usually want to be somewhere around 30% on your brush opacity there, just when you're brushing into a layer mask. I just find that that's a nice kind of subtle amount. And so just brushing into the water here, just to reveal that effect. And there we go. I've done quite a quick job. It's not the most accurate, but you kind of get the idea. So we can also use that just to brighten the side of this rock a little bit, and maybe if the shadows down here are a little bit too dark, we can do the same. And then, okay, let's say let's add another curves adjustment. So that was for brightening the image. Now I know that these colors in the sky are going to look really good if I just darken them, but I don't want to darken the whole image. So let's now just drag the curve adjustment down to darken the sky. And like I said, we don't want this to be applied throughout the whole image, so let's invert the mask again, Command or Control I. Now with that white brush, let's just brush this darkening effect into the sky. So those colors are really starting to pop now. And one final bonus tip that I'll give you for a curves adjustment that you can make to really help make your images stand out, and that is to use what I call a contrast vignette. So let's add yet another curves adjustment layer. And so a vignette, if you're not familiar, is basically the darkening of the edges of an image to bring more attention towards the center of the image, which is less dark. So essentially just, you know, creating like a subtle natural frame around the image to just draw your attention towards the center. So the way that I like to do that using a curves adjustment is to, again, just darken the image a bit. So we're darkening, and then we would, you know, normally a vignette would be done by just at this point inverting the layer mask and then brushing with the brush to kind of brush the darkening effect in around the edges. But the slight tweak that I make to this before doing that is actually clicking on this black point down here in the bottom end of the curve, and then just on the keyboard, because it's quite subtle, I'm just going to press the up arrow key maybe 4 or 5 times. And what that does, it just gives a really nice effect to the shadows. So it's hard to describe. You'll have to kind of test it out just to see for yourself the kind of effect that it gives, but it almost gives it a bit of a matte finish. So doing it this way, I find that, you know, by darkening and then removing that bit of contrast from the shadows to give it that matte finish, that's just another subtle refinement that I think looks really good. So all right, let's just complete the process. So Command or Control I to invert the mask. Got a black brush, and I'm just going to zoom out so that I can use a really big brush to just sort of subtly come around the edges here to brush this effect in. And I think I would do it a bit more in the foreground than in the sky. And that's a good thing about using a curves adjustment to manually brush any kind of vignette effect in, rather than just using a slider that's just going to create a uniform circle around your image. And yeah, that is that you can brush it exactly where you want it. So if we want this effect more in the foreground than in the sky, we can just brush it. So there we go with with that effect there. And so, you know, really in not a very long time and in just a handful of curves adjustments, we've made quite a dramatic change to this original image. So if I just turn all these layers off now, we can see what we started with. And yeah, hopefully you can see there that that's quite a, you know, obviously an unfinished image and still quite a lot of work to do. The colors aren't great, the light is really flat, and it just doesn't look the best. And yeah, with these few adjustments that, you know, to be fair, it's taken a bit longer for me to explain how to create these than it would to just create them yourself once you sort of learn the techniques. So, you know, maybe you could probably do this whole process in just 5 minutes or so once you've once you've had a bit of practice and you're just familiar with each of the techniques. So within 5 minutes you can reasonably expect to go from this kind of result, or this kind of starting image, to this kind of end result. And that is all thanks to just the curves adjustment in Photoshop. Okay, so like I said at the start of this video, if you want to take any of this that you've seen in this video to the next level, then you can get started with using luminosity masking by clicking the link in the description below the video to download my free guide, An Introduction to Luminosity Masking. So that's a PDF, you can download it, print it, and learn how to get up and running with your luminosity masking. And if you haven't done that yet, then I really would recommend it, because it will step things up for you in Photoshop by, you know, quite a few levels. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for watching. See you next time.